August 14th, 1018. The hot, dusty air is thick with the scent of wormwood, sweat, and iron. Silence hangs over the walls of Kiev, the mother of all Rus's cities, a dense, ringing silence filled with fear and anticipation. At the head of the Polish and Allied army, on a mighty warhorse, sits a man whose name has already become a legend from the Elbe to the Dnieper, Bolesław, Prince of the Poles, known as the Brave. His eyes, faded by steppe winds and the smoke of countless battles, gaze upon the majestic golden gates not with the rapture of a conqueror, but with the cold appraisal of a master examining his masterpiece. He has just crushed his main rival in the east, Yaroslav, later known as the Wise, in a fierce battle on the river Bug. He has passed through these lands with fire and sword, and now the grand prize lies at his feet, defenseless and submissive. Obeying a sudden theatrical impulse, he rides up to the gates. In a movement honed by years of practice, he draws his sword from its scabbard, and the air whistles with the sound of steel. A powerful blow strikes the forged iron of the gates. A clang, like the crack of a splitting world, echoes over the hushed city. Legend holds that it was at this very moment that a notch was left on the blade of the sword that would go down in history as the Szczerbiec, the coronation sword of Polish kings. This strike is a symbol of absolute triumph, a gesture of complete domination. Bolesław has taken Kyiv. He sits on the throne of the Rurikids. His warriors are quartered in the homes of Kievans, and his son-in-law and puppet, Sviatopolk the Accursed, is formally restored to the throne. He is the arbiter of the fate of the Rus. And it is here, at this pinnacle of his power, that the greatest paradox of his reign is born, the central question of his life that will puzzle historians for 1,000 years. Why, having achieved everything any conqueror of that era could dream of, did he not stay? Why, after crushing the Wise and taking his capital, did he not place a second crown on his head and create the greatest Slavic empire from the Oder to the Dnieper Rapids? This question transforms the triumph at the Golden Gates from a finale into the beginning of a grand drama about the nature of power, genius, and pragmatism. To understand Bolesław's motives, one must see the world through his eyes, to look at the map of Europe at the dawn of the 11th century. This was not a world of established borders and unshakable thrones. It was a turbulent, brutal arena, a gigantic chessboard where young predators fought for their place in the sun. To the west loomed a colossus, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, heir to Charlemagne, which considered itself the only legitimate empire in the Christian world and viewed the newly converted Slavic peoples as its natural vassals, to be either subjugated or destroyed. To the southeast shone Constantinople, capital of Byzantium, the Second Rome, whose cultural and religious influence extended far to the north, nourishing the spiritual life of Kievan Ruses and serving as an eternal geopolitical rival to the west. Squeezed between these two titans, young, aggressive kingdoms were growing. The Poland of the Piasts, the Hungary of the Arpads, and the vast, yet still amorphous and internally divided Russes of the Rurikids. In this world, faith was not only a path to salvation, but also a powerful political tool. Adopting Christianity in its Latin or Greek rite instantly integrated a ruler into one of the two superpower systems, making him part of a grand civilizational project. A dynastic marriage was not a union of hearts, but an act of war or peace, a way to plunge a dagger into a neighbor's back or secure a fragile alliance for a few years. And from the south, from the endless steppes, rolled waves of nomads, the Pechenegs, ruthless and unpredictable, ready to serve any master for a price and betray him the next day. Bolesław the Brave was born and raised in this boiling cauldron. He knew no other world than one of constant struggle, where survival belonged not to the most pious or just, but to the strongest, the craftiest, and the most ruthless. He instinctively understood that his young Polish state was a fortress besieged from all sides, and the only way to survive was to constantly expand its walls, strike first, and never show weakness. From birth, a heavy but glorious burden weighed on Bolesław's shoulders. The legacy of his father, Mieszko I. It was Mieszko who took the fateful step of adopting Latin Rite Christianity in the year 966, thereby pulling his people from the darkness of paganism and into the family of Western European nations. This act was a stroke of political genius that saved Poland from forced Christianization and absorption by the German princes. Mieszko was the founder, the gatherer of lands, the first historical ruler of Poland, who left behind a state recognized on the international stage. But the shadow of a great father is often ruinous for a son. Bolesław was expected not just to preserve his father's legacy, he was required to surpass it. He had to prove he was not just a pale copy, but an architect capable of erecting a great power on the foundation his father had laid. This psychological drive, this burning desire to outperform his parent, became one of the main engines of his indomitable energy. He saw the incompleteness of Mieszko's work. His father had accepted the faith, but Bolesław had to create an independent church organization, subordinate not to German archbishops, but directly to Rome. His father had fought off enemies, but Bolesław had to become an enemy to be feared. His father held the title of prince, subordinate, even if formally, to the emperor, but Bolesław, from his youth, dreamed of a royal crown, of complete and unconditional sovereignty. His entire life became a race against his father's shadow, a constant effort to raise the bar higher, to seize more, to defeat a stronger foe. This is why he threw himself so fiercely into the confrontation with the Holy Roman Empire. It was a battle not just for land, but for status. This is why he watched the East so closely. The wealthy Rus. It was not just a neighbor, but a potential rival that had to be put in its place to prove to everyone, and above all to himself, that his Poland was the dominant force in the Slavic world. The turning point that transformed Bolesław's ambitions from a dream into a real political project was the famous Congress of Gniezno in the year 1000. This event was so unique and symbolically charged that it can be seen as a kind of prophecy, a foreshadowing of the Polish ruler's future greatness. To Gniezno, the capital of Poland, came the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III himself, on a pilgrimage to the relics of Saint Adalbert of Prague, a friend of Bolesław's who had been killed by pagan Prussians. This was not just a visit. It was a meeting of two worlds and two visions for the future of Europe. Otto, a young and mystically inclined ruler, was obsessed with the idea of renovatio imperii Romanorum, the renewal of the Roman Empire, not as a German entity, but as a universal Christian union of four kingdoms: Rome, Gaul, Germania, and Sclavinia. And in this grand concept, Bolesław was assigned the role of ruler of this Sclavinia, a partner and brother to the emperor. The chronicles describe a scene that captures the imagination. During a feast, Otto took the imperial diadem from his own head and placed it on Bolesław's as a sign of friendship and alliance. He also presented him with a replica of the Holy Lance of St. Maurice. Legally, this was not a coronation, but its symbolic meaning was immense. The emperor, the supreme secular lord of the Western Christian world, publicly recognized the Polish prince as his equal, a brother, a co-ruler in the future world order. For Bolesław, this was confirmation of his chosen status, a divine sanction for his boldest ambitions. He was no longer just one of the Slavic chieftains. He had become a key figure in high European politics. And although Otto III's dream collapsed with his early death just 2 years later, the seeds he had planted in Bolesław's soul produced unshakable growth. From that moment on, Bolesław saw himself not merely as a prince, but as an anointed one destined to wear a royal crown. This event strengthened his resolve and gave his struggle for sovereignty a sacred, almost mystical character. The character capable of withstanding such colossal pressure and realizing such grand ambitions could not have been formed in a sheltered environment. It was forged in the crucible of humiliation, intrigue, and a brutal fight for survival. A key role in Bolesław's development as a politician and a man was played by his youth, spent as a political hostage at the German imperial court. This common medieval practice was a way to guarantee the loyalty of vassal or dependent rulers. By sending his son to the suzerain's court, a father demonstrated submission while giving his heir a unique opportunity to study the mechanisms of power from within. For the young Bolesław, it was a harsh school. He was surrounded by a foreign culture, a foreign language, and an arrogant German nobility that looked down on Slavs with contempt. He learned firsthand what political powerlessness felt like, when your life and freedom depend on the will of another. But instead of breaking, he absorbed everything like a sponge. He observed the complex court etiquette, how intrigues were woven, how alliances were made, and how a single careless word could cost a man his head. He studied the German military organization, their tactics and discipline. He understood that the empire's strength lay not only in its legions, but also in its complex administrative and ecclesiastical hierarchy, in its ability to use law and religion as instruments of control. This forced internship transformed him from a barbarian princeling into a sophisticated European politician. It taught him to hide his true thoughts behind a mask of courtesy, to see friendship as a temporary tactical alliance, family ties as a convenient lever for pressure, and enmity as a valuable resource to mobilize his supporters. He returned to Poland no longer a naive youth, but a man with a cold, calculating mind, a deep understanding of his enemy's psychology, and an unbending will to power. He had learned the ultimate lesson for good. To be respected, you must be so strong that no one would ever dream of taking your son hostage again. Upon returning to his homeland and taking the reins of power, Bolesław immediately began to implement the lessons learned at the imperial court. His first and greatest test, which defined the entire trajectory of his reign, was a series of long and bloody wars with the Holy Roman Empire that began after the death of his patron, Otto III, in the year 1002. The new emperor, Henry II, was the complete opposite of the dreamer Otto. He was a pragmatist and a proponent of a hardline imperial policy, viewing Poland not as a partner, but as a rebellious vassal that needed to be brought to heel. For Henry, an independent and strengthening Poland was a thorn in his side, a threat to German dominance in the region. Conflict was inevitable. These wars, which continued with interruptions for nearly 18 years, became a true school of survival for Bolesław and the forge of his military talent. He could not compete with the empire in terms of troop numbers or economic resources, so he opted for different tactics: guerrilla raids, swift incursions, the use of natural barriers like forests and swamps, and a scorched earth policy that wore down the enemy and deprived them of supplies. He was not afraid to strike at the very heart of enemy lands, sowing panic and chaos. Each campaign was an exam for him, where he honed his skills, learned from his mistakes, and demonstrated an unyielding will to win. It was in these brutal battles that he earned his nickname, the Brave. But this was not the reckless courage of a berserker, but the cold, calculated valor of a commander willing to risk everything, but only when the stakes were justified. These wars taught him the most important lesson. Sovereignty is not granted by imperial favor. It is won with blood and iron on the battlefield. And this experience defined his approach to the Kiev problem. He would act just as he was used to acting in the West. Deliver a swift, devastating blow, take what he needed, and retreat without getting bogged down in a protracted and futile occupation. Behind all of Bolesław's wars, alliances, and political maneuvers lay a single, all-consuming, almost maniacal passion that was both his inner demon and his guiding star, the thirst for a crown. In the hierarchy of the medieval world, a title held a sacred, paramount significance. To be a prince, even the most powerful, meant acknowledging a higher authority, primarily that of the emperor. A prince was merely the first among equals in his dynasty. His power could be challenged. A king, however, was an entirely different figure. A king received his power from God through the rite of anointing. He was sovereign in his own land, equal to other kings and second in status only to the emperor. A royal title transformed a ruler and his state into full-fledged, legitimate players on the international stage. For Bolesław, who had known humiliation at the German court and had fought against imperial claims his entire life, obtaining the royal title became an obsession. This was not just personal ambition. It was a matter of survival and the future of his state. A coronation was meant to permanently remove Poland from German influence, assert its full sovereignty, and secure the PS dynasty's right to the throne. His entire foreign and domestic policy was subordinated to this grand objective. He created an ecclesiastical province in Gniezno, independent of Germany, because only an independent archbishop could, by canon law, crown a monarch. He entered into dynastic marriages with the ruling houses of Scandinavia, Hungary, and Russes to create a network of alliances and enhance his status. He waged grueling wars against the empire, not just for disputed territories, but for the right to be called an independent ruler. Even his campaign to Kiev, as we shall see, was largely dictated by this logic. A resounding victory over the mighty Rus, the humiliation of its ruler, and the capture of its legendary capital were meant to be the final, decisive argument that would compel the entire Christian world, and especially the Pope in Rome, to recognize his right to a royal crown. He went to Kiev not to rule the Russes, but so that this victory would allow him to be crowned, with full right, as the King of Poland. Realizing that great goals require a solid foundation, Bolesław dedicated himself to the internal construction of his state with as much energy as he applied on the battlefield. He understood that to stand against giants like the Holy Roman Empire, courage and military talent alone were not enough. A system was needed. His main pillar of support and instrument of power became the famous drużyna. This was not just a tribal militia, but a permanent professional army consisting of several thousand superbly armed and trained warriors. The members of the drużyna were fully supported by the prince, lived at his court, and were bound to him by ties of personal loyalty. It was a mobile, disciplined force that Bolesław could deploy at any moment, to any point within his state or beyond its borders. In essence, he created one of the most effective armies of its time in Central Europe, which became the key to his military successes. But a strong army requires vast sums of money. Therefore, Bolesław reformed the administrative system, creating a network of grody, fortified settlements, that became not only defensive points, but also centers for collecting tribute and taxes. He ruthlessly centralized power, suppressing the separatism of tribal chieftains and replacing them with his loyal governors. In parallel, he actively supported the Church, understanding its role in strengthening national unity and legitimizing his rule. The establishment of the independent Gniezno Archbishopric in the year 1000 was his greatest diplomatic and political triumph. From then on, the Polish Church was subordinate directly to Rome, not to the German Magdeburg, which was tantamount to a declaration of spiritual sovereignty. Thus, by the time of the Kiev campaign, Bolesław was not the chieftain of a barbarian tribe, but the ruler of a strong, centralized state with a powerful army, a well-oiled administration, and an independent church, a state ready for large-scale external expansion. The actions of Bolesław the Brave rapidly changed the political map of the region, transforming Poland from an object into a subject of high European politics. His expansion was directed to all points of the compass, and it was systematic and well-conceived. In the West, as a result of a long and stubborn struggle with the empire, he managed to defend and annex Lusatia and Milsko, Slavic lands that had previously been under German influence. This was not just a territorial gain, but a symbolic act showing that the Polish ruler could not only defend, but also reclaim lands from the most powerful state in the West. In the south, his gaze turned to the rich and strategically important lands lying on the other side of the Carpathian Mountains. At one stage of his reign, he managed to establish control over Moravia and possibly even a significant part of Slovakia, temporarily incorporating them into his state. This was a bold challenge to both German influence and the young kingdom of Hungary. Under his hand, Poland became a true regional hegemon, a vast state stretching from the Baltic almost to the Danube. Geopolitically, it began to play the role of an iron wedge driven between the German world in the west and the world of the Eastern Slavs, the Rus, in the east. Bolesław controlled important trade routes and acted as an independent center of power that all his neighbors had to reckon with. This rapid expansion, however, also had a downside. It created immense tension along the entire perimeter of his borders. Relations with the Holy Roman Empire, Hungary, Bohemia, and the Rus were constantly on the brink of war. Bolesław lived in a state of permanent mobilization, and this demanded ever more resources, which he could obtain either by exploiting his own population or, far more preferably, through successful military campaigns against wealthy neighbors. And the wealthiest and most vulnerable neighbor at that moment was Kievan Rus. The culmination of Bolesław's Western policy and the prologue to his Eastern campaign was the Peace of Bautzen, concluded on the 30th of January 1018. This treaty, which ended the nearly two-decade-long series of Polish-German wars, was Bolesław's greatest triumph as a diplomat and a commander. The mighty Holy Roman Emperor Henry II, after several failed campaigns into Poland, was forced to the negotiating table and to conclude a peace on terms that were frankly humiliating for imperial pride. Under the terms of the treaty, Bolesław not only kept the disputed lands of Lusatia and Milsko, but also received them from the emperor as an imperial fief, a formality that concealed the real Polish victory. Moreover, the emperor, acknowledging Bolesław's strength and status, provided him with a contingent of 300 German knights for his future campaign against Kyiv. This was an unprecedented step. In essence, the emperor not only admitted defeat, but was also forced to assist the military campaign of his recent enemy, just to redirect his relentless energy elsewhere. The Peace of Bautzen was the peak of Bolesław's power in the West. He had forced the empire to speak with him as an equal. He had secured his western flank, giving him a free hand in the east. Now, nothing prevented him from throwing all his forces into resolving the Kiev question. This triumph went to his head, creating a sense of omnipotence and infallibility. He felt like an arbiter of destinies, with power over all things, and it was in this state, at the pinnacle of his glory and strength, that he decided to march on the Rus. A campaign that was intended to be even more resounding and brilliant than his victory over the emperor himself. The Kiev campaign was for him a logical continuation of the Peace of Bautzen, a demonstration of strength intended not for the West, but for the rest of the world. The key to the drama that unfolded in the East was a complex and tangled dynastic knot that tied the Polish house of Piast to the Kievan house of Rurik. Around the year 1013, Bolesław married his daughter to Świętopolk, one of the many sons of the Grand Prince of Kiev, Vladimir the Great, the baptizer of the Rus. In those times, such marriages were the norm and pursued purely pragmatic goals: to ensure peace on the border, to create a military alliance, or, as in this case, to gain a lever of influence over a neighbor's internal politics. Bolesław certainly hoped to advance Polish interests in Kiev through his son-in-law and daughter, perhaps hoping that Świętopolk would become Vladimir's heir. This marriage, intended as an instrument of alliance, turned out to be the fuse lit to a powder keg. Relations between Vladimir and Świętopolk, as well as between Vladimir and Bolesław, were extremely tense. At one point, Vladimir even imprisoned his son Świętopolk, his wife, Bolesław's daughter, and her confessor, Bishop Reinburn, on suspicion of conspiracy. This episode was a personal insult to Bolesław and laid the foundation for future enmity. At the same time, the star of another of Vladimir's sons, Yaroslav, who ruled in Novgorod, was rising on the political stage. Yaroslav was intelligent, calculating, and ambitious. He was already showing defiance to his father and clearly aiming for the Kievan throne. Thus, even during Vladimir's lifetime, a triangle of hatred and rivalry had formed. Bolesław, who saw an opportunity for expansion in Kievan affairs; Świętopolk, who craved power and was ready to do anything for it; and Yaroslav, the future wise, who saw both Świętopolk and the Bolesław standing behind him as his main enemies. This family drama, mixed with personal ambition and high politics, was destined for a bloody resolution. The detonator that shattered the fragile peace in Rus was the death of Grand Prince Vladimir the Great in July of 1015. Immediately after his father's passing, an abyss of fratricidal war opened up, one of the most brutal in the history of the early Rus. The central figure in this tragedy was Bolesław's son-in-law, Świętopolk. Being in Kiev, he seized the grand princely throne and, in an effort to eliminate his rivals, committed a monstrous crime. On his orders, his younger brothers, Boris and Gleb, Vladimir's beloved sons, were murdered. The Rus' church would later canonize them as the first passion-bearing saints. This atrocity forever earned Świętopolk the nickname the Accursed. Another brother, Yaroslav, who ruled in Novgorod, rose up against the fratricide. Assembling an army of Novgorodians and Varangian mercenaries, he marched on Kiev. In a fierce battle near Lubech, he defeated Świętopolk's army. The accursed prince was forced to flee, and the only place he could seek help and refuge was the court of his powerful father-in-law, Bolesław the Brave. For the Polish ruler, the moment of truth, a fateful crossroads, had arrived. He faced a choice: intervene in the bloody Russian internecine conflict, risking a long and unpredictable war, or stay aside, conserving his strength but missing a unique opportunity. For a man with Bolesław's ambitions, such a choice did not really exist. The plea for help from his exiled son-in-law was not the burden of a family duty, but a priceless gift of fate, a golden chance that comes once in a century. He had the perfect, legitimate pretext for an invasion, to restore the lawful prince to the throne. He had the opportunity to crush the rising power of the Russes, to enrich himself with its legendary treasures, and to settle disputed border issues in his favor once and for all. The choice was made. The great campaign to the east was now inevitable. At the beginning of 1018, Bolesław the Brave was at the zenith of his power and glory. He had just triumphantly concluded a years-long confrontation with the Holy Roman Empire, forcing the emperor himself to accept a humiliating peace at Bautzen. His authority in Europe was unquestionable. His army, hardened in battles against the finest knights of the West, was considered invincible. At that moment, he probably saw himself not just as a ruler, but as a true arbiter of destinies, with the power to change borders and place kings and princes on thrones. This was the classic moment of hubris that often precedes great achievements or great catastrophes. Success in the West bred in him the confidence that an easy and swift victory awaited him in the East as well. He looked upon the Rus, torn by internal strife, as easy prey. Yaroslav, despite his initial victory over Sviatopolk, seemed to him an inexperienced youth compared to an old wolf like himself, who had been through fire and water. The campaign to Kiev appeared to him not as a risky venture, but as a brilliant demonstration of power, destined to become the jewel in his crown, the most celebrated of all his deeds. He craved not just victory, he craved glory that would endure for centuries. The capture of Kyiv, the legendary city, the mother of all Rus's cities, the richest center of trade on the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, was meant to place him among the greatest conquerors in history. This pride, this sense of his own omnipotence, was the most powerful psychological fuel for the upcoming campaign. He already saw himself entering the Golden Gates, sitting on the throne of Vladimir and Yaroslav, dictating his will to all of Eastern Europe. And this dazzling vision of the future blinded him to the potential risks and dangers, making his resolve absolute and unshakable. However, behind the glittering facade of military might and political triumph, the first troubling cracks were beginning to appear. Nearly 2 decades of continuous wars with the Holy Roman Empire, though ending in victory, had placed a heavy burden on Poland's economy. The treasury was depleted. The huge professional army, the pillar of Bolesław's power, demanded regular pay, rewards, and the spoils of war. The warriors were weary from the long war in the West and were grumbling. To maintain their loyalty, Bolesław urgently needed a source of quick and substantial enrichment. The country's internal resources were exhausted. In this situation, a campaign against the rich but strife-weakened Russes seemed not only an act of geopolitics, but also a pressing economic necessity. In his eyes, Kyiv was not just an enemy capital, but a gigantic treasury filled with Byzantine silk, Arab silver, furs, honey, and wax. Capturing this city promised immense loot that could more than cover all the costs of the war, allow him to generously reward his soldiers, replenish the treasury, and give a new impetus to the economy. Thus, Bolesław was driven to the Kiev campaign not only by pride, but also by cold economic calculation. It was, in essence, a grand commercial operation disguised as a dynastic obligation. He was marching on the Russes for glory, but even more so for gold. This dual motivation largely predetermined the outcome of the entire campaign. He had no intention of building an empire on conquered lands, as that would require huge and long-term investments. He needed a quick, resounding victory that would allow him to solve his current financial problems and consolidate his power within Poland. It is this pragmatic, almost cynical approach that is one of the main keys to unraveling the paradox of his departure from Kiev. And so, the decision was made. In the spring of 1018, Bolesław ordered the campaign to begin. This was not merely an act of assistance to his son-in-law, but a carefully planned, full-scale invasion, unprecedented in its scope for that era. Bolesław gathered a huge army under his banners. Its core was his own Polish drużyna, hardened in battles against the Germans. But he did not stop there. Thanks to his diplomatic triumph at Bautzen, he received an auxiliary contingent of 300 elite German knights from Emperor Henry II, heavy cavalry that represented a formidable force. In addition, he hired 500 Hungarian horsemen, known for their ferocity and martial skill. But his most fearsome allies were the Pechenegs. Bolesław, a true pragmatist, did not shy away from alliances with pagans if it served his purposes. He made an agreement with the Pecheneg Khans, and from the south, out of the steppes, thousands of wild, untamable horsemen moved to his aid. This alliance was deadly for the Rus, as the Pechenegs were its old and sworn enemy, knew the terrain perfectly, and spread terror and chaos in the enemy's ranks. The army Bolesław assembled was truly international and one of the most powerful forces ever to invade the lands of the Kievan Rus. The very fact of such thorough and large-scale preparation indicated that Bolesław's goals went far beyond simply restoring Świętopolk to the throne. He was not coming to negotiate. He was coming to crush. This fateful act, this decision to throw all his forces against the Rus, became the point of no return, setting in motion the wheels of a war that would forever change the balance of power in Eastern Europe and bring two of the greatest rulers of their time into a mortal clash. In this grand military campaign, Świętopolk, the accursed, the formal pretext for the invasion, played a role no greater than that of a pawn in the hands of an experienced grandmaster. Bolesław the Brave was too shrewd and seasoned a politician to have any illusions about his son-in-law. He saw his nature perfectly, treacherous, cowardly, and utterly unprincipled. A man who had murdered his own brothers could inspire neither trust nor respect. Bolesław used Świętopolk as a convenient banner, a legal cover for his aggression. The title of lawful prince in Świętopolk's mouth was merely a propaganda tool that allowed Bolesław to present his invasion not as a conquest, but as an act of justice. Deep down, he likely despised this pathetic puppet, who was completely dependent on his sword. Bolesław's true goals were far more ambitious. First, to inflict a crushing military defeat on Kievan Rus' as a state, to weaken it for a long time, and to eliminate it as a potential geopolitical competitor in the East. Second, to seize vast spoils needed to solve his own economic problems. Third, to definitively settle the territorial dispute over the Chervan cities, a rich region on the border of Poland and Rus', in his favor. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, to achieve a loud, resounding victory that would glorify his name throughout the world and serve as a weighty argument in his struggle for the royal crown. Restoring Świętopolk to the throne was merely an intermediate tactical move, nothing more. Bolesław understood that a regime installed by foreign bayonets and led by a fratricide hated by the people could not be durable, and most likely he did not even aspire to that. He needed chaos and weakness in Russes, not a strong and stable allied state. This cynical yet utterly pragmatic attitude toward his ally predetermined the entire subsequent logic of his actions in Kiev. Having gathered all its forces, Bolesław's multinational army moved eastward like a wall of fire, spreading terror across the lands of the Rus. It was a relentless, methodical advance of power, sweeping away everything in its path. The chronicles of the time, though sparse in detail, allow us to imagine the scale of this invasion. Tens of thousands of warriors, heavy Polish and German cavalry clad in iron, light, and swift Hungarian horsemen, and of course, countless hordes of pechenegs who fanned out across the countryside, looting, killing, and burning everything they came across. For the inhabitants of the Rus, it was a true calamity, comparable to a natural disaster. Yaroslav's army, which had gathered in Kiev, was significantly smaller and consisted mainly of Kievan and Novgorodian retinues, as well as Varangian mercenaries. He decided to meet the enemy on the western border of his lands, on the western Bug River. It was here on the riverbank that the clash was to take place that would decide the fate of the entire campaign. This was not just a battle between two armies. It was a clash of two worlds, two personalities, two titans who personified their peoples and their eras. On one side, Bolesław the Brave, a mature 50-year-old ruler, seasoned in dozens of battles and political intrigues, a genius of tactics and strategy at the peak of his power. On the other, Yaroslav, the future wise who was about 40 years old, a ruler who did not yet have such colossal military experience, but was already known for his intellect, persistence, and unbending will. He was defending his land, his capital, his right to the throne. It was a battle of experience against youth, aggression against defense, a clash of two great historical figures, each destined for a great future. But at this particular moment, one of them had to be crushed. The decisive battle of the entire campaign took place in July of 1018 on the banks of the western Bug River. Yaroslav had taken what he believed to be an advantageous defensive position on the eastern bank, setting up outposts and expecting Bolesław to spend several days preparing to cross, building bridges or searching for fords. This was standard tactics for the time, and the Kievan prince felt relatively secure. He had underestimated his opponent. Bolesław was a master of unexpected and bold decisions. Seeing that Yaroslav's army had settled down to rest, he, in defiance of all canons of military art, gave the order for an immediate attack. Without any preparation, under the cover of the morning mist, his warriors plunged into the water and began to ford the river. The maneuver was so sudden and swift that it caught the Rus' army completely by surprise. While Yaroslav's warriors were panicking and trying to form up for battle, Polish and German knights were already emerging onto the bank and charging straight into their ranks. A brutal and bloody slaughter began. According to the chronicler Thietmar of Merseburg, Bolesław personally led his warriors into the attack, being the first in the fight. The defeat of Yaroslav's army was total and unconditional. The retinue, unable to withstand the onslaught of the heavy cavalry, faltered and fled. Yaroslav himself, seeing the complete collapse of his forces, barely managed to escape with a few companions. The Battle of the River Bug was a triumph of Bolesław's military genius and a catastrophe for Yaroslav. It was a total rout that demonstrated the superiority of the Polish war machine and the tactical thinking of its leader. The path to Kyiv, the heart of the Rus, was open, and Bolesław had no intention of delaying. The defeat on the Bug was not just a military setback for Yaroslav, but a profound personal humiliation. He, who considered himself the rightful ruler of the Rus, had been utterly defeated and forced into a shameful flight. His entire army was either destroyed or scattered. The baggage train, the treasury, everything was captured by the victor. In a panic, he fled not to his capital city of Kiev, which there was no one left to defend, but far to the north, to his loyal Novgorod. According to the Chronicle, his morale was so crushed that he was ready to give up the fight. He thought of fleeing even further, across the sea to Scandinavia, from where his Varangian lineage originated. At that moment, the entire history of Eastern Europe hung in the balance. Had Yaroslav carried out his intention, the Ruses might have been plunged into chaos for a long time or fallen under complete Polish domination. But here, the trait for which he would later earn his nickname, the Wise, manifested itself. His persistence and his ability to learn from his mistakes. The people of Novgorod, unwilling to have the fratricide Sviatopolk and his Polish patron as their prince, showed unprecedented resolve. They told Yaroslav, "We can still fight for you." They chopped up his boat so he could not sail away and collected new funds to hire a fresh Varangian retinue. This episode became a turning point in Yaroslav's development as a great statesman. He was crushed, but not broken. The humiliation he experienced turned into a burning desire for revenge. While Bolesław celebrated his triumph in Kiev, a new force was already rising from the ashes of defeat in the north, led by a bitter but wiser Yaroslav. And this was one of the main reasons why Bolesław could not feel secure, even while sitting on the throne of Kyiv. After the catastrophe on the Bug, the path to the capital of the Rus was clear. On the 14th of August, 1018, Bolesław the Brave, at the head of his victorious army, triumphantly entered Kyiv. The city, deprived of its army and prince, offered no resistance. The Kievans, led by the clergy, came out to meet the conqueror with crosses and banners, begging for mercy. For Bolesław, this was the hour of his greatest glory. He entered the mother of all Rus's cities, not merely as an ally of Sviatopolk, but as the complete and undisputed master. He demonstratively sat on the grand princely throne in the main cathedral, emphasizing his supremacy. His troops were quartered in the homes of the citizens. Sviatopolk also entered the city with him, but his return brought no joy to the Kyivans. They saw him only as a puppet and an accomplice of foreign invaders. Bolesław was in complete control of the situation. He sent his governors to other Rus's cities, demanding tribute and submission. He behaved not as a guest, but as a conqueror. It was at this moment, at the pinnacle of his success, that he made the symbolic gesture that would forever enter history and legend. He struck the golden gates of Kiev with his sword. This act was a pure demonstration of power, a declaration of his triumph to the whole world. He had conquered the greatest city in Eastern Europe, humiliated its ruler, and was now dictating his will. But behind the outward brilliance of this victory, the seeds of future problems were already hidden. The presence of a huge foreign army behaving as masters could not fail to provoke sullen resentment among the population. Triumph threatened to turn into a protracted and bloody occupation. While in Kiev, Bolesław fully savored his triumph and sought to make the whole world know of it. He understood that a military victory, unbacked by political recognition, loses half its value. Therefore, he took an extraordinary step. From the captured capital of the Rus, he sent proud and boastful messages to the two most powerful rulers of the Christian world, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry II in the west and the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, in the east. The content of these letters, as recounted in the Chronicle of Tietmar of Merseburg, perfectly reveals Bolesław's true motives and goals. He did not write about restoring the legitimate rights of his son-in-law. He wrote of his personal victory, of his own greatness. He spoke with mockery and contempt of the fugitive Yaroslav, calling him lazy and cowardly. He boasted of how easily he had captured the great and wealthy city. These letters were an act of self-assertion on the international stage. By sending them, Bolesław placed himself on par with the emperors, addressing them not as a vassal or a minor prince, but as an equal, a new powerful player who would henceforth have to be reckoned with. His main goal was not the annexation of Russian lands to Poland, but the affirmation of his personal status and the status of his state. The Kiev campaign was, for him, a grand public relations event. He had demonstrated his military might to the world, humiliated a strong rival, and now expected this triumph to be the final and decisive argument in his long struggle for a royal crown. He did not need the principality of Kiev. He needed the glory of being the conqueror of Kiev. And having obtained this glory, he began to prepare for the next step in his plan. However, the euphoria of a quick and easy victory began to fade rapidly, replaced by the harsh reality of occupation. Governing a huge, foreign, and potentially hostile city proved to be far more difficult than capturing it. The tens of thousands of Polish, German, and Hungarian warriors quartered in Kiev and its surroundings behaved as conquerors do. They demanded food, drink, took valuables, and ran rampant. This inevitably led to rising tension and hatred from the local population. If at first the Kyivans were paralyzed by fear, resistance gradually began to fester. According to the chronicles, clandestine attacks on Polish soldiers and arson began in the city. Each day in Kiev became increasingly dangerous for Bolesław's army. He found himself facing the classic dilemma of any conqueror. To control the city, he needed to maintain a large garrison, but the very presence of this garrison provoked ever-increasing resistance, requiring even more troops. It was a vicious circle. Furthermore, sustaining such a huge army far from home was a colossal logistical problem. Food supplies were dwindling. Discipline in the army, corrupted by idleness and looting, began to decline. Bolesław, as an experienced commander, could not fail to see these alarming signs. He understood that time was working against him. The longer he stayed in Kyiv, the higher the probability of a full-scale urban uprising that could become a trap for his army. The situation was aggravated by news from the north, where the humiliated but unbroken Yaroslav was already gathering new forces for a rematch. The conqueror's burden proved to be crushingly heavy. To the external problems, the hostility of the population and the threat from Yaroslav, was added an internal one, related to the figure of Sviatopolk the Accursed. Formally, Bolesław had restored him to the Kievan throne, but in reality all real power remained in the hands of the Polish ruler and his garrison. Sviatopolk was merely a puppet, and he knew it well. Being an ambitious and treacherous man, he could not long tolerate such a humiliating role. He wanted to be not his father-in-law's deputy, but a sovereign ruler. Seeing that Bolesław was in no hurry to leave, and fearing that he might decide to annex Kiev to his own domains, Sviatopolk apparently began to play a double game. The chronicles directly accuse him of giving a secret order to his men to attack the Poles in order to provoke a conflict and force them to leave. Although there is no direct proof of this, such a version seems perfectly logical in light of his character. He decided to get rid of his liberators using the same method he had used to get rid of his brothers: betrayal and secret assassinations. For Bolesław, this was the final straw. He was not only facing resistance from his enemies, but had also been stabbed in the back by the very man for whom he had supposedly undertaken this campaign. He was finally convinced of his son-in-law's worthlessness and unreliability. It became obvious that leaving him in Kiev as a loyal ally was pointless. He would betray him at the first opportunity, and to stay himself to support his power was too dangerous and costly. The puppet's betrayal made a further stay in Kyiv not only risky, but also politically meaningless. By the autumn of 1018, Bolesław the Brave found himself in a situation known in chess as zugzwang. Any subsequent move leads to a worsening of one's position. To remain in Kyiv meant inevitably facing several threats at once. First, a full-scale uprising of the citizens, which could turn the city into a death trap for his garrison. Second, a war with Yaroslav, who, having gathered a new army of Varangians and Northerners in Novgorod, was already preparing for a revenge campaign. To fight on two fronts, against a rebellious city and against a regular army, would have been suicidal. Third, a logistical nightmare. Supplying a huge army hundreds of kilometers from Poland, in hostile territory, with winter approaching, was becoming practically impossible. His army could simply die from hunger and disease, but to simply leave, abandoning everything, would mean admitting defeat, losing face and nullifying the entire effect of his great victory. Bolesław was faced with the crucial question: what to do next? How to get out of this situation not just alive, but as a victor. And it was here, at this critical moment, that he displayed not just bravery, but the genius of a true statesman. He realized that the main goal of the campaign had already been achieved. Yaroslav was crushed and humiliated. The fame of his victory had spread throughout Europe. Immense spoils had been collected. And now, he needed not to cling to the symbolic but burdensome prize of controlling Kiev, but to lock in his profits and exit the game at the right time. The decision he made was unexpected, but it was the only correct one. And Bolesław found a way out. Brilliant, pragmatic, and entirely in his style. He neither defended Kyiv to the last man, nor fled from it in shame. He organized a grand, triumphant exodus. This was not a retreat. It was a planned, strategic withdrawal that looked more like the departure of a victor taking his rightful spoils. Having collected the immense treasures accumulated by the Kievan princes over decades, gold, silver, furs, expensive fabrics, weapons, he loaded it all onto a huge baggage train and began his journey back. But he took more than just material wealth. As honored captives, he took with him two of Yaroslav's sisters, one of whom, Predslavia, had previously refused his hand in marriage, and whom, according to the chronicler, he took as a concubine in revenge for the humiliation. This was an act of personal vengeance and further humiliation for his enemy. In addition, he took thousands of prisoners, artisans, and common citizens who were to work and settle Polish lands. But the most important and real territorial acquisition was the Chervon cities, or Red Ruthenia, a rich and strategically important region on the border of Poland and Rus', long a subject of dispute. On his way back, Bolesław simply annexed this region to his state. Thus, the finale of the Kiev campaign was paradoxical and ironic. Bolesław did not become the ruler of Kiev, but he got everything that had real, practical value for him. Money for his treasury and army, glory for his name, humiliation for his enemy, and a new, rich province for his state. He traded the illusory and burdensome crown of the Kievan prince for tangible and weighty trophies. This was the decision not of a dreamer imperialist, but of a brilliant predator who, having struck down his prey, takes the best pieces and leaves, unburdened by the excess. Returning to Poland, Bolesław the Brave was at the zenith of his glory and power. He was the wealthiest monarch in the region, the vanquisher of the emperor, and the conqueror of Kiev. His authority was absolute, and he decided that the time had come to fulfill his life's dream. For all these years, he had patiently waited for a favorable moment for his coronation, but two main obstacles always stood in the way: the resistance of the German emperor and the position of the Pope, who did not want to conflict with the empire. Now, the situation had changed. His old and implacable enemy, Emperor Henry II, had died in 1024 and was succeeded by Conrad II, who was preoccupied with internal problems and could not effectively oppose Bolesław. Seizing this window of opportunity, Bolesław, without waiting for formal papal consent, took a bold and decisive step. In the year 1025 in Gniezno, he was solemnly crowned as the first king in the history of Poland. This was the crowning achievement of his life, the apogee of his long struggle. He had achieved everything he wanted. He had created a powerful, centralized state, defeated all his enemies, achieved full sovereignty, and inscribed his name in history as the founder of the Polish kingdom. Fate, however, allotted him very little time to enjoy his triumph. Just 2 months after his coronation, in June of 1025, King Bolesław I, the Brave, passed away. His death was as dramatic and timely as his entire life. He departed at his peak, undefeated, having fulfilled all his dreams. This finale, as if written by a great dramatist, brought his epic journey to a close, transforming him from a mere historical figure into a national myth. The legacy of Bolesław the Brave, like that of any great and controversial ruler, is dual and multifaceted. Its perception differs radically depending on which side of the border one views it from. For the Poles, he is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, figures in their national history. He is the creator of the kingdom, the Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland, a wise ruler and an invincible commander who forced the mighty German Empire to reckon with Poland and crushed the strong Kievan Rus. In Polish national memory, he has forever remained a symbol of strength, independence, and state greatness. The legend of the Szczerbiec, the sword supposedly notched on the golden gates of Kiev, became a powerful cultural myth, a symbol of Polish imperial ambitions and claims to dominance in Eastern Europe, which would inspire and excite the minds of Poles for many centuries to come. However, on the other side of the Bug River, in Ukraine and Russia, his image is entirely different. Here, he is a treacherous and ruthless aggressor, an invader who, taking advantage of internal turmoil, came to the Russian land with fire and sword, plundered its capital, and took thousands of people captive. His alliance with the fratricide Sviatopolk the Accursed only adds darker shades to his portrait. In East Slavic historiography, his campaign is seen as one of the first acts in a centuries-long confrontation with their Western neighbor, as a manifestation of perennial Polish aggression. Thus, the same historical figure became a national hero for one people and a symbol of hostile invasion for others, vividly illustrating how subjective and politicized historical memory can be. Now, having traced the entire path of Bolesław, from his youth to his death, we can give a final and comprehensive answer to the central question posed at the outset. Why did he take Kiev, but not become its ruler? The answer lies in the man's brilliant pragmatism. Bolesław the Brave never set himself the goal of becoming the ruler of the Rus. This campaign was not an act of imperial conquest. It was the largest, most audacious, and brilliantly executed punitive raiding operation in the history of medieval Europe. Holding Kiev and governing the vast Russian lands would have been strategic suicide for the Poland of that time. It would have required colossal military and administrative resources that he simply did not have. It would have meant perpetual war with the Rurikids and a hostile population. Bolesław was not an adventurer. He was a realist. He clearly defined for himself 4 specific and achievable goals, and the Kiev campaign was the instrument for their achievement. The first goal, military-political, to crush and permanently weaken Kievan Russes as his main competitor in the east. Achieved. The second goal, dynastic propaganda, to place a weak, dependent puppet, Svyatopolk, on the Kievan throne and demonstrate his role as an arbiter of destinies to the world. Achieved, albeit briefly. The third goal, economic, to seize immense spoils to replenish his treasury and reward his army, which was exhausted from the wars in the West. Achieved in full. The fourth goal, territorial, to annex the disputed and wealthy Chervan cities, settling the border issue by force of arms. Achieved. Having accomplished all these tasks, he saw no reason to remain in Kiev. Further occupation offered no benefits, only mortal risks. And so he left, taking with him all the fruits of victory and leaving behind chaos and a weakened enemy. The paradox is resolved simply. He did not become the ruler of Kiev because it was never part of his brilliant and cynical plan. The story of Bolesław the Brave and his Kiev campaign is not just a tale of medieval wars and the ambitions of one ruler. It is a timeless, universal lesson about the nature of power, strategy, and political realism. It teaches us that the greatest wisdom of a leader lies not in the ability to capture, but in the deep understanding of what is worth holding and what must be relinquished in time. Bolesław, unlike many other great conquerors in history, did not succumb to the temptation of imperial pride. He did not allow the glitter of Kievan gold and the grandeur of the Dnieper hills to blind his pragmatic mind. His famous departure from the conquered capital was not a sign of weakness or fear, as his enemies might have thought. On the contrary, it was an act of supreme strategic wisdom, a demonstration that true strength is measured not in the square kilometers of controlled territory, but in the ability to achieve set goals with maximum efficiency and minimal cost. He showed the world that sometimes the strongest move on the chessboard is not to take an enemy piece, but to move your own out of danger, securing your advantage. Ultimately, the story of Bolesław the Brave leaves us with a profound thought. Triumph is not always about standing on the peak of what you have conquered. Often, it is the wisdom to take a timely step back in order to win the entire game. And it is in this ability to distinguish a strategic objective from a vain illusion that the true genius of a great ruler lies, a ruler whose lessons remain relevant even 1,000 years later.